Welcome to my presentation. Today I would like to talk about a paper with the title Researching Teams Across the Extremeness Continuum, Inherent Challenges and Opportunities. This is a paper I'm working on together with Maynard from Colorado State and Nadine Bienefeld from the ETH in Zurich. So SWAT teams, firefighters, Antarctic expedition teams and astronaut teams are four examples of teams that operate in extreme environments. These teams face tremendously high levels of challenges. So the management and organizational studies can learn a lot from these extremes. They provide rich insight into organizational processes of adaptation, prioritization, or resilience, where more traditional teams can learn from. In the last 5 years, a lot of literature has been published about extreme teams. However, the literature is fragmented and lots of papers are published in practitioner journals, which makes it hard to integrate the results, compare, and move the field forward. Therefore, a unifying framework is necessary, and that was the goal of our paper. We did a literature review about extreme teams and looked very closely to the definitions, how these extreme teams are defined. Based on these definitions, we then came up with a framework about team extremeness versus extreme teams. And this extremeness framework will help us classify and compare the teams. So we found almost 3,000 papers and screened titles and abstract and found around 50 papers that were relevant for our study. So 3 dimensions appeared over and over again in the definitions of extreme teams, which were complexity of task, hostility of the environment, and consequences of bad performance. So complexity of task means that extreme teams often deal with unpredictable tasks. There's a high need of improvisation and adaptation, and there's a high interdependence between team members. Hostility of environment means that the environment itself in which the task is carried out poses a threat to the team, like Antarctica or space. Consequences of bad performance means that the impact of bad performance on the team, the client, or even others, for example, a patient. So I'd like to illustrate these 3 dimensions where all the teams can be categorized, either low or high complexity, hostility, or consequences. So let me illustrate this with a few examples. Here you have an example of a window cleaner team. Complexity, hostility, and consequences are probably low. So consequence of bad performance is probably a dirty window, which is not that bad. However, we can change the environment and keep the complexity and the consequences the same. So here we have window cleaners in Mexico City cleaning the windows of a skyscraper. And of course, because they're hanging from a tall building, the environment got much more hostile. The task itself remained the same. They're still cleaning windows, which is not super complex. And the consequences of bad performance is still dirty windows, which is not that bad. So only the environment changed and made this team a little bit more extreme. Here's another example, an emergency team, a medical emergency team. Here they have a very complex task, so a lot of team members need to coordinate high time pressure, they need to adapt, assess and evaluate. The consequences are high too, because bad performance leads probably to the death of the patient, but the environment is not very hostile, so there's no threat from the hospital surrounding to the team. If we take now a team, exactly the same emergency team, and put it into a war zone, all of a sudden here also the environment poses a threat. And all 3 dimensions are on a high level of extremeness. Here's an example of a surgical team where the extremeness can change within a task. So we have a routine surgery, which is low or medium complexity, depending on the surgery. There is no hostility from the outside in the surgical room, and the consequences are still high, right? If bad performance happens, then the patient might again die in extreme case. If during this routine surgery now non-routine something happens, all of a sudden the complexity increases, or it gets much more extreme because the team has to adapt to changing circumstances and the task gets much more complex. So the last example are astronaut teams in space. Here we see two astronauts working on a microgravity glove box for a physics research project. The complexity is probably medium. The surrounding, they're on the International Space Station, so the surrounding space is hostile, but the consequences of bad performance is low. So if they mess up this research project in this box, probably not much will happen. Maybe they have to throw away a few samples, but there's no threat to them or some other people. However, on the same space station, here you can see Tim Kopra and Scott Kelly. They're working on a machine that removes CO2 on the International Space Station. Due to a malfunction in 2015, the CO2 level was rising and posing a serious threat to the astronauts. So the two astronauts had to repair this machine. And of course, if they would fail or would have failed, this would have had serious consequences for them, and therefore consequences are again more extreme. So we argue that every team can be categorized using the 3 dimensions. A more traditional project team would probably be here, and then all the other teams could be placed on different positions depending on the 3 levels of extremeness. I think it's also important to note that we include time. So if we take software engineering teams, for example, here, how would you rate the extremeness of this team? Probably low, maybe medium if the task is complex. But if we then think about the consequences that such software can have over the long term, for example, here, when we look at the crash of the Boeing 737 MAX in 2018 over Ethiopia, that actually crashed because of a software problem. So here, the outcome extremeness of the software engineering team actually increased. So to sum up, I think the next step would be to think about measuring extremeness. So there can be an outside view, more objectively, or an inside view, if we ask the team members, is something extreme or not extreme? So the subjective assessment of extremeness of the team members will probably vary. A very skilled surgeon would probably say a specific surgery is not very extreme, versus a resident that is doing a surgery for the first time will probably see this surgery as more extreme. I think the framework also does not entirely solve the problem of comparability. So the question remains, is a war zone the same level of extremeness as space, for example? However, I think the framework provides a more nuanced definition of extremeness in teams, where all teams can be categorized on a continuum of extremeness. And I'm hopeful that this framework will help to integrate the fragmented literature so that the different fields can learn from each other and move the field of team research forward. Thank you very much.